The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the operating room at Mercy General Hospital in Cedar Falls, Iowa. Sarah Mitchell moved quietly between the surgical instruments, her navy blue scrubs crisp and clean, her movements precise and practiced. She'd been working as a nurse at this small-town hospital for 3 months now, and in that time, she'd kept mostly to herself. "Nurse Mitchell, we need those sutures now, not next week," Dr. Bradley Hammond snapped, his voice sharp with irritation. He was the hospital's head surgeon, a man in his late 50s who wore his authority like a crown. Sarah handed him the sutures without a word, her green eyes steady and calm. This wasn't the first time Dr. Hammond had spoken to her that way, and she knew it wouldn't be the last. "She's too slow," one of the surgical residents whispered to another, not bothering to lower his voice much. "I don't know how she got hired here, probably some diversity quota thing." Sarah's jaw tightened slightly, but she kept her focus on the patient before them, a middle-aged man who'd been in a car accident on Route 20. His life depended on the team working together, and Sarah refused to let petty insults interfere with that. Dr. Hammond made an incision, and Sarah anticipated his next 3 needs before he could ask. Clamp, suction, gauze. Her hands moved with an efficiency that came from years of experience, though no one in this room knew just how much experience she really had. "At least she's good at following orders," the resident muttered with a smirk. Sarah had heard worse, much worse. During her 15 years as a combat medic in the Army, she'd worked in field hospitals in Afghanistan and Iraq, operating in conditions these doctors couldn't imagine. She performed emergency surgeries in tents while rockets exploded overhead. She'd saved lives with limited supplies and no backup, but she didn't talk about that. Not here, not yet. She'd come to Cedar Falls to start over, to find some peace after retiring from military service. The nightmares had been getting worse, and her therapist at the VA hospital suggested a quieter life might help. So she'd taken her nursing credentials, moved to this small Iowa town where her late grandmother had once lived, and tried to blend in. But blending in meant enduring the dismissive attitudes, the casual disrespect, the assumption that she was just another nurse who couldn't cut it anywhere else. "Dr. Hammond, his blood pressure is dropping," Sarah said, her voice calm but firm as she monitored the patient's vitals. "I can see that, Nurse Mitchell," Dr. Hammond replied dismissively. "I've been doing this for 30 years. Just keep the instruments ready." Sarah bit back her response. She could see what Dr. Hammond apparently couldn't. The patient was bleeding internally, somewhere they hadn't found yet. The signs were there if you knew what to look for. The rapid pulse, the pallor, the way the abdomen was distending slightly. "Doctor, I think we need to." "What you think, Nurse Mitchell, is not required right now," Dr. Hammond interrupted, his eyes never leaving his work. "Your job is to assist, not to diagnose." The other nurses in the room exchanged uncomfortable glances, but no one spoke up. Dr. Hammond ran his oar like a dictator, and challenging him was a quick way to end up on the night shift permanently, or worse, looking for a new job. Sarah took a deep breath and stepped back, but her eyes never left the monitors. She'd learned patience in the military. She'd learned when to follow orders and when those orders were wrong. And she'd learned that sometimes you had to wait for the right moment to act. The patient's blood pressure continued to drop, 90 over 60, 80 over 50. The alarm on the monitor began to beep urgently. "He's crashing," the anesthesiologist called out, sudden panic in his voice. Dr. Hammond's confident expression faltered for the first time. His hands, usually so steady, began to shake slightly as he searched for the source of the bleeding. "I can't find it," he muttered, his voice tight with stress. "Where is it coming from?" The room erupted into controlled chaos. Nurses rushed to prepare additional blood units. The surgical residents crowded closer, trying to help but mostly getting in the way. And Dr. Hammond, the man who'd been so confident just moments before, stood frozen over the patient, his face pale with fear. Sarah Mitchell watched the scene unfold, and something inside her shifted. She tried to do things their way, tried to be quiet and invisible, but she couldn't stand by and watch a patient die. Not when she knew exactly what needed to be done. The monitor's alarm grew more insistent, its shrill beeping matching the rising panic in the operating room. The patient's blood pressure had dropped to 70/40, and his heart rate was climbing dangerously high as his body struggled to compensate for the blood loss. "Someone page Dr. Williams," Dr. Hammond shouted, his usual commanding tone now edged with desperation. "And call the blood bank, we need O-negative stat." Sarah watched as the surgical team stumbled over each other, their movements becoming frantic and uncoordinated. In her years as a combat medic, she'd seen this before, the moment when fear took over and training fell apart. It happened to even the best teams when they lost their center. "Dr. Hammond," Sarah said, her voice cutting through the chaos with unexpected authority. "The bleeding is from the splenic artery. You need to extend the incision laterally and pack the left upper quadrant." Dr. Hammond turned to her, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "I don't recall asking for your opinion, Nurse Mitchell. Now get back to—" "His pressure is 60/30, the anesthesiologist interrupted, his voice cracking with stress. "We're losing him." Sarah made a decision. She'd spent 3 months being invisible, 3 months swallowing her pride and her expertise. But she hadn't survived 2 tours in combat zones and saved hundreds of lives just to watch a man die because of someone else's ego. She moved forward, her hands already reaching for the retractors. "Doctor, with all due respect, if you don't let me help right now, this man is going to die on your table." The room went silent except for the machines. Every eye turned to Sarah, shock written across the faces of the surgical team. No one spoke to Dr. Hammond that way. No one. Dr. Hammond's face turned purple with rage. "How dare you? I will have your nursing license for this. Security. Someone get security up here and remove this woman from my OR." But before anyone could move, the anesthesiologist's voice rang out. "He's in VFib. We need to shock him now." The patient's heart had stopped beating properly, instead quivering uselessly in his chest. They had seconds, not minutes. Someone grabbed the defibrillator paddles, but Sarah knew that shocking the heart wouldn't matter if they couldn't stop the bleeding first. "Please," Sarah said, looking directly at Dr. Hammond. Her voice was steady, but there was something in her eyes, a depth of experience and pain that made him pause. "Let me show you. I've done this before, many times." For a moment their eyes locked. Dr. Hammond saw something there that gave him pause, a certainty, a competence that couldn't be faked. And perhaps in that moment of crisis, his own fear made him willing to accept help from any source. "Fine," he said through gritted teeth, stepping back slightly. "But this is on you." Sarah didn't waste time responding. Her hands moved with a speed and precision that stunned everyone watching. She extended the incision exactly where she'd indicated, and suddenly they could see what she'd known was there. A tear in the splenic artery, pumping blood into the abdominal cavity. "Clamp," she said, and her voice carried the unmistakable tone of command. The surgical resident handed it to her without thinking, responding to the authority in her voice. Sarah clamped the artery in one smooth motion, and the bleeding slowed immediately. "Pack the area," she instructed, and the nurses moved to follow her directions as if she'd been leading the team all along. "His rhythm is back," the anesthesiologist said, relief flooding his voice. "Pressure is starting to come up, 70/40, 80/50. The tension in the room shifted from panic to amazement as they watched Sarah work. Her hands moved with a grace and efficiency that spoke of countless hours in operating rooms far more challenging than this one. "Suture," she said, and began to repair the damaged artery with neat, perfect stitches. As she worked, she gave quiet instructions to the team, her voice calm and steady, guiding them through each step of stabilizing the patient. Within 10 minutes, the bleeding was controlled, the artery was repaired, and the patient's vital signs were returning to normal. Sarah stepped back from the table, her scrubs now stained with blood, and looked at Dr. Hammond. The surgeon stood there, his mouth slightly open, staring at what had just happened. The surgical residents and other nurses watched Sarah with new eyes, seeing her clearly for the first time. "Who are you?" one of the residents whispered, voicing the question on everyone's mind. Sarah peeled off her surgical gloves and took a deep breath. She'd kept her past buried for 3 months, hoping to leave it behind. But maybe it was time to stop hiding who she was. "My name is Sarah Mitchell," she said quietly. "And before I came here, I was a major in the United States Army Medical Corps. I spent 15 years as a combat surgeon in field hospitals in Afghanistan and Iraq." The room remained silent, everyone processing this information. The quiet nurse they dismissed and underestimated was a decorated military surgeon who'd operated under fire in war zones. Dr. Hammond's face went through several shades of red before settling on a pale, ashamed white. I didn't know." "You never asked," Sarah said simply. "You never asked any of us what we were capable of. You just assumed." The surgery was completed without further incident, though the atmosphere in the operating room had changed completely. The resident who'd made the snide comments earlier couldn't meet Sarah's eyes as they closed the patient's incision. Dr. Hammond worked in silence, his usual running commentary and criticism notably absent. When they finally wheeled the patient to recovery, Sarah stripped off her surgical gown and left the OR without a word. She walked down the hallway toward the nurse's locker room, suddenly exhausted. The adrenaline that had carried her through the crisis was fading, leaving behind the familiar weight of memory and grief. She'd saved the patient's life, but in doing so, she'd opened a door she'd been trying to keep closed. The nightmares would be worse tonight. They always were when she had to use her combat skills. Every time her hands moved with that practiced efficiency, every time she made those split-second decisions that meant life or death, she was back in those field hospitals, surrounded by wounded soldiers, the sound of explosions never far away. Sarah was changing out of her scrubs when Dr. Hammond appeared in the doorway of the locker room. He cleared his throat awkwardly, and several other nurses who'd been chatting quietly suddenly found reasons to be elsewhere. "Nurse Mitchell, or should I say Major Mitchell," he began, his voice uncharacteristically uncertain. "It's just Sarah now," she said, not turning to face him. "I'm retired from the military." "I owe you an apology," Dr. Hammond said. "What you did in there, you saved that man's life. If you hadn't spoken up, if I hadn't disobeyed your direct orders," Sarah interrupted, finally turning to look at him. Her voice wasn't angry, just tired. "If I hadn't overstepped my place as just a nurse." Dr. Hammond flinched. "I deserved that. I've been treating you badly since you arrived. I've been treating a lot of people badly if I'm honest with myself." Sarah studied him for a moment. She could see the shame in his face, but also something else, genuine remorse. "Why?" she asked simply. The surgeon ran a hand through his gray hair, suddenly looking every one of his 58 years. "Pride, I suppose. Fear. I've been the top surgeon here for 20 years. This is a small hospital in a small town, and maybe I liked being the biggest fish in a small pond. Anyone who might challenge that, I pushed down. Even if it hurt patients." Sarah's voice was sharp. "I never thought," Dr. Hammond trailed off, then shook his head. "No, I don't get to make excuses. You're right. My ego could have cost that man his life today." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of what had almost happened hanging between them. "Why didn't you tell anyone about your background?" Dr. Hammond asked finally. "When you interviewed for the position, your resume just said Army nurse. It didn't mention that you were a combat surgeon, that you had 15 years of experience in trauma medicine." Sarah sat down on the bench, suddenly needing to get off her feet. because I was trying to leave that behind. Do you know what it's like, doctor, to spend 15 years in war zones? To operate on 18-year-old kids who stepped on IEDs? To watch soldiers die on your table because there wasn't enough blood or the right equipment or because the wounds were just too catastrophic? Her voice remained steady, but her hands trembled slightly as she clasped them together. I came here because I thought working in a quiet hospital in small-town Iowa would help me forget. I thought if I was just a regular nurse doing regular nursing work, maybe the nightmares would stop. Maybe I could be normal. Dr. Hammond lowered himself onto the bench beside her, careful to maintain a respectful distance. Are they bad, the nightmares? Some nights I wake up and I can still hear the mortars, still smell the blood. I'll be standing in the grocery store and suddenly I'm back in the field hospital, trying to triage 30 wounded soldiers with only 2 other medics. Sarah looked down at her hands, hands that had saved hundreds of lives but couldn't save them all. I have PTSD, doctor. The VA diagnosed me before I left the service. They recommended a quieter life. And instead you found me being a tyrant in the OR, Dr. Hammond said quietly. I found a lot of people who underestimated me, Sarah corrected. But I've dealt with worse. I just wanted to keep my head down and do my job. The door to the locker room opened, and one of the other nurses poked her head in. Sarah, there's someone here to see you. He says he's from the Army. Sarah's head snapped up, her entire body suddenly tense. The Army. Dr. Hammond stood as a man in dress uniform entered the locker room, his shoes polished to a mirror shine, his bearing unmistakably military. He was in his 40s, with sharp eyes and the weathered look of someone who'd seen combat. Major Mitchell, the man said, saluting crisply. I'm Colonel James Peterson, U.S. Army Medical Corps. Sarah stood automatically, her military training making her return the salute before she'd even thought about it. Sir, I'm retired now. So I heard, Colonel Peterson said, his expression unreadable. But the Army doesn't forget its best, especially when they leave under difficult circumstances. Sarah's face went pale. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't you? The colonel pulled a folder from under his arm. Major Sarah Mitchell, Bronze Star with Valor, Silver Star, Purple Heart, 15 years of distinguished service, 98% survival rate for patients who reached your operating table alive, the highest in the entire medical corps. Dr. Hammond's eyes widened as he listened to the list of commendations, beginning to understand just how extraordinary the nurse he'd been dismissing really was. And then 3 years ago you were court-martialed, Colonel Peterson continued, his voice neutral. Dishonorably discharged, your military record sealed. What did they say the charges were again? Disobeying a direct order, insubordination. Sarah's hands clenched into fists. I did what I had to do. Yes, the colonel said, and now his expression softened slightly. You did, and that's why I'm here. Sarah felt the room spinning slightly, the past she tried so hard to bury suddenly thrust into the light. Dr. Hammond looked between her and the colonel, confusion written across his face. I think, Dr. Hammond said carefully, that someone needs to explain what's going on here. Colonel Peterson looked at Sarah. May I, or would you prefer to tell it? Sarah's jaw tightened. She'd spent 3 years trying not to think about that day, that terrible decision that had cost her everything she'd worked for. But maybe it was time. Maybe carrying it alone for so long was part of what was eating her alive. There was a mission, she began, her voice distant, as if she was watching the memory from far away. 3 years ago in Kandahar province, Afghanistan, a convoy of soldiers was ambushed, 20 wounded, all critical. They were brought to our field hospital within the hour. She closed her eyes and suddenly she was there again. The heat, the noise, the overwhelming smell of blood and antiseptic and fear. My commanding officer, Colonel Briggs, ordered me to prioritize treating the American soldiers first. It was standard protocol, treat our own first, then allies, then civilians. but one of the wounded was an Afghan interpreter. He'd been working with our troops for 5 years. He had a wife and 3 children, and he was bleeding out from a severed femoral artery. Colonel Peterson nodded, taking up the story. Major Mitchell assessed the situation and determined that the interpreter would die within minutes without immediate intervention, while the American soldiers, though seriously wounded, were stable enough to wait. "So I treated him first," Sarah said, opening her eyes. "I saved his life, but while I was operating on him, one of the American soldiers went into cardiac arrest. The other surgeon on duty couldn't revive him. He died." The locker room was silent, except for the distant beep of hospital machines and the murmur of voices in the hallway outside. "Colonel Briggs blamed me," Sarah continued. "He said if I had followed orders, if I had treated our soldier first, he would have lived. He brought me up on charges of disobeying a direct order in a combat zone and dereliction of duty." "The court-martial was quick," Colonel Peterson said. "Too quick. They made an example of Major Mitchell. Dishonorably discharged, military pension revoked, medical credentials questioned. The message was clear: you follow orders, even when those orders might be wrong." Dr. Hammond's face had gone pale. "But you saved that interpreter's life. You made a medical decision based on who needed immediate care." "That's not how the Army saw it," Sarah said bitterly. "They saw a soldier who put a foreign national above an American service member. Never mind that I would have lost them both if I'd done what Briggs ordered. Never mind that the soldier who died had an undiagnosed heart condition that probably would have killed him anyway. All that mattered was that I disobeyed orders." "So why are you here?" Sarah asked, turning to Colonel Peterson. "The Army made its decision. I'm a civilian now, a disgraced civilian." The colonel's expression shifted, and for the first time, Sarah saw something like satisfaction in his eyes. "Because 3 months ago, that Afghan interpreter you saved, Rashid Khan, helped prevent a major terrorist attack in Kabul. His intelligence work saved hundreds of lives, including 30 American soldiers. He's being granted asylum in the United States, along with his family." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "And when the story came out," Colonel Peterson continued, "when the press started asking questions about this interpreter who'd risked everything to work with American forces, his story got the attention of some very important people, including a senator who sits on the Armed Services Committee." The colonel pulled a document from his folder. "Major Mitchell, the Army has reviewed your case. We've looked at the medical records, at the testimonies, at what really happened that day. Colonel Briggs was found to have acted improperly. His orders were not sound medical practice, and you were right to prioritize based on medical need, not nationality." He held out the document. "Your dishonorable discharge has been vacated. Your record is being corrected to show an honorable retirement. Your military pension is being restored with back pay, and the Army would like to offer you a formal apology." Sarah stared at the paper, unable to move. 3 years. 3 years of shame, of nightmares, of believing she'd failed. 3 years of being told she was wrong for making the right choice. "The interpreter," she whispered. "Rashid, he's really okay." "He's more than okay," Colonel Peterson said, smiling now. "He's in the United States, working as a consultant for the State Department. And when he heard what had happened to you, he made it his mission to clear your name. He's the one who went to the senator. He's the one who pushed for this review." Tears were streaming down Sarah's face now, years of held-back emotion finally breaking through. "I didn't know. I never knew what happened to him after I left." Dr. Hammond, who'd been listening in stunned silence, finally spoke. "Major Mitchell, Sarah, I don't know what to say. Everything I thought about you, everything I assumed. I was so wrong." Sarah wiped her eyes, trying to compose herself. "You couldn't have known." "I should have seen," Dr. Hammond insisted. "The way you move in the OR, the way you handled that crisis today, those aren't the skills of a regular nurse. I was so busy being arrogant that I missed what was right in front of me." Colonel Peterson cleared his throat. "There's one more thing, Major. The Army would like to offer you your rank back, along with a position at Walter Reed Medical Center. We need surgeons with your experience and skills." Sarah looked at the document in her hands, then at the colonel. For 3 years she'd been running from her past, trying to be someone smaller, quieter, less than who she was. And where had it gotten her? The nightmares hadn't stopped. The grief hadn't faded. She'd just been hiding. Sarah stood in the locker room, the document trembling in her hands, and felt the weight of the decision pressing down on her. In one hand she held redemption, her name cleared, her honor restored, a chance to return to the work she'd been trained for. In the other, she held the quiet life she'd been building in Cedar Falls, small and safe and far from the chaos of military medicine. "Can I have some time to think about this?" she asked Colonel Peterson. The colonel nodded. "Of course, there's no pressure, Major. You've earned the right to make this decision on your own terms." He handed her a card. "My contact information. Call me when you're ready." After he left, Sarah sat back down on the bench, still clutching the document. Dr. Hammond remained with her, seemingly unsure whether to leave or stay. "What will you do?" he asked finally. Sarah shook her head. "I don't know. 3 months ago I would have given anything for this, but now," she gestured vaguely at the hospital around them, "I've started to build something here. Friends, a routine, a life." "A life where you're hiding who you really are," Dr. Hammond said gently. "A life where you're working far below your capabilities because you're afraid of being hurt again." Sarah looked at him sharply, but there was no judgment in his face, only understanding. "I was watching you today," he continued. "When that patient started crashing, you transformed. It wasn't just your skills, though those are extraordinary, it was your presence. You became the person you were trained to be, the leader you were meant to be. And I saw something else too." "What?" Sarah asked quietly. "I saw relief," Dr. Hammond said. "Relief at not having to pretend anymore. Am I wrong?" Sarah thought about it, about how it had felt in those moments when training and instinct took over, when she'd stopped being the quiet nurse in the corner and became the surgeon she'd spent 15 years becoming. He was right. It had felt like relief, like coming home. "But the nightmares," she began. "Will be there whether you're operating at Walter Reed or taking vitals in Cedar Falls," Dr. Hammond interrupted. "PTSD doesn't care about geography, Sarah. It doesn't care about how quiet you try to make your life. You need treatment, yes, but you also need purpose. You need to be who you are." Before Sarah could respond, one of the nurses burst into the locker room. "Dr. Hammond, Sarah, it's the patient from the car accident. He's awake and asking for the nurse who saved his life." Sarah and Dr. Hammond exchanged glances, then quickly made their way to the recovery room. The patient, whose name they'd learned was Robert Miller, was propped up slightly in bed, his wife holding his hand. His face was pale, but his eyes were alert. "You're the one," he said when he saw Sarah, his voice rough from the breathing tube. "The nurses told me. They said I was dying on the table and you saved me." Sarah approached the bed, her professional demeanor returning. "I was just doing my job, Mr. Miller. How are you feeling?" "Like I got hit by a truck," he said with a weak smile. "But I'm alive. My wife says I'm alive because you stood up to the surgeon, because you knew what to do when no one else did." His wife, a woman in her 50s with red-rimmed eyes, stood up and hugged Sarah before she could react. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for fighting for him, for not giving up." Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, some piece of the armor she'd been wearing for 3 years beginning to crack. This was why she'd become a doctor, not for the recognition, not for the glory, but for this. For the husband who got to go home to his wife. For the father who would see his children grow up. For the lives saved and the families kept whole. Over the next week, word of what had happened in the OR spread through Cedar Falls. The local newspaper ran a story. Local nurse revealed as decorated combat surgeon. Patients started requesting Sarah by name. Other doctors at the hospital began seeking her opinion on difficult cases, and Dr. Hammond, true to his word, began treating his entire team with more respect, more humility. But it was a visitor on Thursday afternoon that finally helped Sarah make her decision. A man walked into the hospital lobby with 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, all under 10 years old. He was in his 40s, with dark hair and eyes that had seen too much, and he asked the receptionist where he could find Major Sarah Mitchell. Sarah was coming off her shift when the receptionist paged her. She walked to the lobby, tired and ready to go home, and stopped dead when she saw him. "Rashid," she whispered. The man smiled and tears filled his eyes. "Major Mitchell, I had to come. When I heard you were here, when I heard what you've been through because of what you did for me, I had to come." Sarah crossed the lobby in 3 strides and embraced him, both of them crying now. The children watched with wide eyes as their father and this American woman held each other, 3 years of grief and gratitude pouring out. "You're alive," Sarah said, pulling back to look at him. "You're really alive and you're here and you're safe." "Because of you," Rashid said. "Because you chose my life over following orders. Because you believed I was worth saving." "You were always worth saving," Sarah said fiercely. "You are worth saving, don't ever doubt that." Rashid introduced his wife and children, and they spent an hour in the hospital cafeteria, drinking coffee and catching up. He told her about the intelligence work he'd done after recovering, the terrorist plot he'd helped uncover, the lives he'd saved in return for the life she'd given him. "I heard the army offered you your rank back," Rashid said finally. "Will you take it?" Sarah looked at this man and his family, at the children who had a father because of a choice she'd made, a choice she'd been punished for, a choice she'd do again in a heartbeat. "Yes," she said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "Yes, I will." 2 weeks later, Sarah stood in Dr. Hammond's office, wearing her dress uniform for the first time in 3 years. The hospital had organized a small ceremony to honor her before she left for Walter Reed. Dr. Hammond presented her with a plaque, his voice emotional as he spoke. "Major Mitchell taught us all a lesson. She taught us that true skill doesn't announce itself. It simply is. She taught us that following orders isn't the same as doing what's right. And she taught this old surgeon that there's always more to learn, even after 30 years. The hospital staff applauded, and Sarah saw genuine warmth in their faces. No more dismissive looks, no more underestimation. They saw her now. But the moment that mattered most came afterward, when Dr. Hammond pulled her aside privately. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since you came here," he said. "About my teaching methods, about how I treat people. I've enrolled in some workshops on leadership and respect in medical settings. I'm trying to be better." "That's good," Sarah said sincerely. "And I've recommended that the hospital create a trauma surgery position," he continued, "with full surgical privileges. I told them that if someone of your caliber ever decides to leave Walter Reed and come back to Cedar Falls, we should be ready to offer you more than just a nursing position." Sarah smiled, touched by the gesture. "Thank you, that means a lot." As she drove out of Cedar Falls toward her new life, or really, her old life reclaimed, Sarah thought about the journey she'd been on. She tried to hide from her past, to become smaller and quieter and less than who she was. But hiding hadn't healed her. It had only made the pain more concentrated, more intense. Maybe healing didn't come from running. Maybe it came from standing tall, from embracing who you were, scars and all. From using your gifts, even when they came wrapped in painful memories. From choosing, again and again, to save lives, even when saving lives meant facing your demons. Her phone rang. It was the VA hospital where she'd been receiving treatment. "Major Mitchell, just calling to confirm your appointment next week. We've got you set up with a trauma specialist at Walter Reed Psychiatric Services, and I wanted to let you know we've got a support group for combat medics and surgeons. They meet twice a week. I really think you should join." "I will," Sarah said. "Thank you." As she merged onto the highway, heading east toward Washington and her new beginning, Sarah caught sight of herself in the rearview mirror. For the first time in 3 years, she recognized the woman looking back at her.